They said he was digging his own grave. Again. Late November, 1886, Frostback Hollow. The whole town watched Elias Marrow pull up his own cabin floorboards, plank by plank, and disappear beneath them with a shovel and a lantern. His neighbors had woodsheds, stacked, locked, guarded against thieves and wind the like. Elias had something stranger, a hole beneath his own home, deepening every night after his daughter, 8-year-old Wren, fell asleep by the hearth. "Papa, why are you digging under the house?" she asked one morning, dust still in his hair. He only handed her a piece of dry bark and said, "Feel how light it is. Now imagine it never getting wet again." She didn't understand, not yet. By January, a blizzard tore through Frostback Hollow that would freeze wood piles into solid ice, bury sheds under 12 feet of drift, and leave grown men with nothing left to burn. Only one house in town would still have dry wood when it was over, and it wasn't stacked outside at all. If this story pulls you in even a little, drop a comment and hit subscribe, because what this man buried under his own floor is about to save more than just his family. Late November, 1886, Frostback Hollow. The whole settlement watched Elias Marrow tear up his own cabin floor, plank by plank, and vanish beneath it with a shovel and a lantern, and more than one neighbor whispered that grief had finally taken his mind. "A widower digs strange holes," they said. "A sane man stacks wood outside like everyone else." But Elias kept digging, night after night, long after his daughter had fallen asleep by the hearth, and he never once explained why. Only a year earlier, Elias Marrow had been the most trusted builder in Frostback Hollow, the man every family called when a roof leaked or a wall shifted before winter. He had a steady wife, a warm cabin, and more firewood stacked against his shed than most men could burn in 2 seasons. Then his wife Sarah caught a fever that the doctor could not name and could not stop. By the time the aspens turned gold, Elias had sold his second horse, his good saw, and half his tools to pay for medicine that never worked. When she was gone, the town expected him to rebuild slowly, the way every widower did. Instead, he grew quiet, and quiet men on the frontier were often the ones about to do something nobody understood. His daughter Wren was only 8, and she had already learned not to ask her father too many questions when his jaw was set like that. She watched him from the doorway one gray morning, dust caught in his hair, his hands raw from gripping the spade. "Papa, why are you digging under the house?" she finally asked, and Elias only knelt down, broke a piece of dry bark in half, and held it toward her. "Feel how light this is," he said. "Now imagine it never getting wet again, not once, all winter." Wren turned the bark over in her small hands and frowned. She did not understand what her father meant, not yet, but something in his voice told her this was not one of his ordinary projects, and that whatever he was building beneath their floor mattered more than anything he had built above it. Word travels fast in a town with only one road, and within days, half of Frostback Hollow had an opinion about the hole growing under the Marrow cabin. Some said he was hiding money. Others said he had lost his senses along with his wife. A rancher named Cyrus Thistle laughed the loudest at the general store, telling anyone who would listen that a man burying himself under his own home before the first snow even fell was asking winter to finish what grief had started. Elias heard the talk every time he rode into town for nails or rope, and he never once argued back. He simply loaded his wagon, tipped his hat, and rode home to keep digging, because he had learned a long time ago that explaining a lesson before it was needed rarely convinced anyone at all. Besides, a part of him wondered if the laughter would matter much once January arrived, and that thought alone was enough to keep his shovel moving long after most men would have given up and gone back inside. The truth was, Elias was not digging out of grief or madness. He was remembering something his own father had taught him 20 years earlier, back when they had lived through a winter so brutal that every woodshed in their old settlement had frozen solid under ice, leaving grown men clawing at their own firewood with axes just to start a morning fire. His father had shown him then that wood left out in open air did not simply freeze, It soaked up moisture from snow and frost until it refused to burn at all, no matter how desperate the hands trying to light it. Dry wood is not found, his father had said. It is protected long before winter ever asks for it. Elias had carried those words quietly for 2 decades, never needing them, until the day he stood alone in his cabin staring at his wife's empty chair and realized that protecting his children now meant more than repairing anyone else's roof. So each night, after Wren and her younger brother Silas were asleep, Elias lit a single lantern, pulled back 3 loose floorboards near the hearth, and lowered himself into the widening pit beneath his own home. He shored the walls with split cottonwood posts, packed the floor with dry clay, and left a narrow shaft near the chimney base where warm air from the hearth above could quietly settle downward instead of escaping through the roof. It was slow, exhausting work, done in secret, in the cold, with blistered hands and a lantern that burned lower every hour. Wren began noticing the sawdust on his boots each morning and the new calluses forming across his palms. And though she never asked again, she started paying closer attention to every board he touched, every measurement he whispered to himself, every time he pressed his palm flat against the dirt, as if listening for something only he could hear. By the 2nd week of December, the shape of what Elias was building had become unmistakable to him, even if the rest of Frostback Hollow still called it a hole and nothing more. He had shaped a hidden chamber directly beneath his own floor, dry, insulated, and completely out of reach of wind, snow, or frost, a place where firewood could rest for months without ever feeling the touch of winter. But the deeper he dug, the more the sky above Cold Larch Pass began to change, heavy clouds pressing low over the ridgeline, the air growing sharper with each passing evening. Elias stood at the edge of his unfinished pit one night, lantern trembling in his hand, and looked up through the gap in his floorboards toward a sky that no longer looked like ordinary winter weather at all. The storm that rolled over Cold Larch Pass 3 nights later did not arrive quietly. It came down off the ridge like something with a grudge, flattening fence lines and tearing shingles loose before midnight had even settled in. The kind of wind that made grown men check their doors twice. Elias had finished his chamber only 2 days before, the last cottonwood post wedged into place, the last armful of split wood stacked below his own floor instead of outside where the wind could reach it. He had barely closed the trap door over the pit when the first gust rattled his windows hard enough to shake dust from the rafters, and for one long moment, standing there in the dark with Wren and Silas asleep behind him, Elias wondered if he had finished just in time or a single day too late. By morning, Frostback Hollow looked like a town that had been erased and redrawn in white. Snow had piled higher than most fence posts, burying woodsheds up to their roofs and turning stacked cordwood into solid, useless mounds of ice. Cyrus Thistle, the same rancher who had laughed loudest at the general store, stood outside his own shed swinging an axe against a wall of frozen bark, cursing under his breath as chips flew and nothing gave way. Down the road, the Hallorans tried the same, then the Baiters, then half the families who had once called Elias foolish for what he built beneath his floor. Every one of them had done exactly what the frontier had taught them to do: stack it high, stack it outside, trust the shed. None of them had ever imagined the shed itself becoming the enemy, and none of them had a spare hour to spend chopping through ice when their children were already shivering behind frosted windows. Inside the Marrow cabin, the morning looked almost ordinary. Elias lifted the loose floorboards near the hearth, climbed down into the chamber he had dug in secret, and came back up carrying dry, split wood that had never once felt snow or frost against it. Wren stood at the top of the ladder, watching her father's breath fog in the cold air of the pit below, and for the first time she understood what the bark had meant weeks earlier. "It never got wet," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. Elias only nodded and struck a match, and within minutes the hearth was crackling with a fire that caught fast and burned clean, none of the hissing, damp struggle their neighbors were fighting through at that very hour. If you've ever been the one everyone quietly judged for doing things differently, even when you were only trying to protect the people you love, drop a comment below and tell me about it, because I promise you, by the end of this story, you'll understand exactly why Elias never once explained himself to anyone in town. Some lessons only make sense once the weather finishes teaching them, and Frostback Hollow was about to get a very hard lesson indeed. Never judge a man for the strange thing he builds quietly in the dark. Sometimes it's the only thing standing between his family and the cold. By the second day of the storm, word had begun to travel despite the drifts, carried by the few men still willing to fight their way between homesteads for news. The thistle place had gone through nearly half its remaining fuel trying to thaw frozen cordwood with hot coals and patience, both of which were running out fast. The schoolhouse had closed its doors entirely, its little stove unable to keep pace with a building that leaked heat through every warped seam in its walls. Families were already burning chair legs and old fence rails just to keep a single room bearable through the night. And at the Marrow cabin, smoke rose steady and thin from the chimney, the same as it had the morning before, and the morning before that, drawing exactly the kind of attention Elias had spent all autumn trying to avoid. Rowan Bellwether noticed it first, riding the fence line to check on scattered cattle before the drifts made the task impossible. He passed within sight of the Marrow place twice that day, and both times the same quiet ribbon of smoke curled into the gray sky, steady as a heartbeat, while every other chimney around it either struggled or had gone dark entirely. He remembered the whispers from the general store, the widower and his strange hole beneath the floor, and for the first time since the laughter began, Rowan felt something closer to unease than amusement. A man does not burn wood that easily in a storm like this, he thought, unless he has more of it, and drier, than anyone else in the valley. He turned his horse toward home that evening with the thought still nagging at him, unable to shake the feeling that he had laughed at the one man in Frostback Hollow who actually understood what winter demanded. That night, as the wind screamed low across Cold Larch Pass, and snow buried the last visible corner of Cyrus Thistle's woodshed completely, Wren lay awake on her pallet, listening to her father's slow footsteps as he checked the trap door one final time before settling by the fire. She thought about the bark he had handed her weeks earlier, and the calluses on his hands, and the quiet way he had never once needed anyone's permission to be right. Outside, the storm showed no sign of slowing, and somewhere down the valley, a lantern moved slowly toward their cabin through the blinding white, carried by a man who had laughed the loudest and was about to knock on a door he never expected to need, unaware that what waited behind it would change how he saw every quiet, strange thing his neighbors did for the rest of his life. Rowan Bellwether knocked twice before the wind tore the sound away from his own knuckles. When the door finally opened, warmth rolled out to meet him before a single word had been spoken, thick and steady. Nothing like the thin heat leaking from his own hearth back home. Elias stood in the doorway holding a lantern, unsurprised, as though he had expected this exact visit on this exact night. Rowan stumbled through the threshold, snow falling from his coat in clumps, and for a moment he simply stood there, letting his frozen hands remember what warmth felt like, his fingers aching as they slowly came back to life in the heat of the room. He had come expecting to check on a widower and his children out of duty. He had not expected to feel, within seconds, that he had walked into the one house in Frostback Hollow that winter had failed to touch. Elias offered him coffee before either man spoke of woodsheds or storms, and Rowan drank it slowly, eyes moving around the small cabin, searching for the source of a warmth he could not explain. The fire in the hearth was modest, nothing larger than what any family might build on an ordinary evening, yet the room held its heat the way still water holds a reflection, calm and unbothered no matter how hard the wind outside tried to reach it. Wren watched from her pallet, pretending to sleep, one eye open just enough to see the man who had laughed loudest at her father now sitting quietly at their table, hands wrapped around a tin cup like it was the only solid thing left in the world. It was Elias who finally spoke first, setting his own cup down and nodding toward the floor near the hearth. "There's something under there," he said simply. Rowan frowned, glancing at the boards beneath his boots, and Elias knelt, lifted 3 loose planks and revealed the dark opening beneath. Cool air drifting up, carrying the faint, dry scent of split wood untouched by frost. He climbed down first, lantern in hand, and Rowan followed slowly, boots finding the narrow ladder rungs one at a time, until both men stood in a chamber packed floor to ceiling with dry firewood, stacked in neat, deliberate rows, not a single piece damp or frozen or wasted. If you've ever built something quietly, unsure whether anyone would ever understand why, comment below and tell me what it was, because Rowan Bellwether was about to learn that the strangest ideas often come from people who simply refuse to lose what they loved twice. He ran his palm along a row of stacked wood, feeling the dryness, the weight, the complete absence of ice that had turned his own woodshed into a useless block days earlier. He said nothing for a long moment, and in that silence, every insult he had ever spoken outside the general store seemed to hang somewhere over his head, waiting to be answered. "How?" he finally asked, and Elias did not offer a long explanation. He only pointed upward, toward the floor above them, then toward the narrow shaft near the chimney base where a faint current of warm air moved steadily downward instead of escaping through the roof like heat did in every other cabin in the valley. "Wood outside freezes because the ground and the wind both work against it," Elias said quietly. "Wood beneath a warm floor, sealed from snow, sheltered from frost, only sits and waits to be useful." He had not invented the idea from nothing. He had simply remembered what his own father taught him after a winter that once broke an entire settlement's fuel supply, leaving grown men clawing at frozen bark with axes, and he had refused to let his children learn that same lesson the hard way. Rowan returned home before dawn, carrying 2 armfuls of dry firewood Elias had insisted he take, and for the first time in days, his own hearth caught fast and burned clean instead of hissing and struggling against damp bark. He told no one at first, uncertain how to explain what he had seen without sounding foolish himself. But by the 4th day of the storm, when his own wife asked how he had suddenly found dry wood in a town buried under ice, the truth came out slowly, carefully, the way confessions often do. Word moved through Frostback Hollow the same way the mockery once had, except this time it carried something closer to respect, passed from one frozen doorway to the next, each family realizing that the man they had laughed at loudest was the only one who had never once run out of fire. And that realization sat heavier on some of them than the storm itself ever had. By the time the roads finally opened and wagons could move again, half the town had already begun asking Elias quiet questions instead of quiet insults, standing at his fence line with notebooks and rough sketches, trying to understand a lesson that winter had already taught them the hard way. Cyrus Thistle came last of all, standing awkwardly at the edge of the yard with his hat in his hands, unable to meet Elias's eyes as he asked, almost in a whisper, whether a man might learn to dig something similar before next winter arrived. Elias only nodded and reached for a shovel, because he had learned long ago that some lessons were worth repeating quietly rather than proving loudly. And somewhere behind him, Wren stood in the cabin doorway, holding the same piece of dry bark her father had given her weeks before, finally understanding exactly why he had never explained himself to anyone, and wondering what other quiet answers her father might still be keeping buried beneath the floor, waiting for a winter that hadn't asked its question yet. Winter loosened its grip on Frostback Hollow the way it always did, slowly, reluctantly, as if the cold itself hated giving up ground it had fought so hard to hold. The last drifts melted into the creek beds by late March, revealing fence posts that had been buried for weeks and woodsheds still standing crooked from the weight of ice that had crushed their corners. Families spent that spring rebuilding what the storm had taken, patching roofs, replacing shattered shelves, counting what little furniture remained after burning half of it just to survive 4 brutal days, and quietly grieving the animals and belongings the cold had claimed along the way. Elias Marrow rebuilt nothing. His floor had never been touched by frost, his walls had never lost their fight against the wind, and the only thing that changed at the Marrow place that spring was the number of visitors walking up the path with questions instead of judgment.
Cyrus Thistle was the first to ask for real help, arriving one morning with a borrowed spade and none of the pride he had carried all autumn. Elias never mentioned the laughter from the general store, never brought up the insults traded outside the feed shop, and never once made the man feel smaller than the mistake he was trying to fix. He simply walked Cyrus out to a corner of his own cabin, showed him where the ground stayed driest, where the frost line sat shallowest, and where a chimney's warm draft could be coaxed downward instead of upward. Within a month, 3 other families had started their own version of the same idea, each one shaped a little differently, none of them exact copies, because Elias never taught a method. He only taught a way of noticing. If you've ever watched someone change their mind about you without ever hearing them say sorry out loud, comment below and tell me, because that was exactly what happened in Frostback Hollow that spring. Nobody apologized to Elias Marrow. Nobody needed to. The empty woodsheds standing crooked across town had already said everything that mockery once tried to say, and the quiet respect now walking up his path every week said everything an apology never could. Elias accepted none of it as vindication. He simply kept working, because the goal had never been to prove anyone wrong. It had only ever been to keep his children warm. Wren grew older that year, in ways nobody quite expected from a girl who had spent one long winter watching her father dig in secret. She began keeping her own notes, small observations scratched onto scrap paper about which boards felt colder before a storm, which corners of the cabin lost heat first, which mornings the chimney drew clean, and which mornings it fought back. She never asked her father to check her work. She simply left it beside his tools, and more than once he found himself nodding at conclusions she had reached entirely on her own. Quiet proof that the habit he carried from his own father had already taken root in someone smaller than him. Someone who would carry it forward long after his own hands grew too tired to hold a shovel. By the following autumn, the hidden chamber beneath the Marrow floor no longer felt like a secret at all. Neighbors passing on the road sometimes nodded toward the cabin instead of whispering about it, and children from town occasionally asked Wren, not Elias, how deep the pit went and whether it ever flooded in spring. She answered every question patiently, the way her father once answered hers, with nothing but a piece of bark and a quiet sentence, because she had learned that explaining too early rarely taught anyone anything at all. Some lessons only mattered once winter asked the question first, and by then, most people in Frostback Hollow finally understood exactly what Elias had been protecting all along, and why he had never once needed their approval to keep doing it. Rowan Bellwether never forgot that night either. The warmth of that cabin meeting him before a single word had been spoken, the quiet chamber packed with dry, waiting firewood while his own shed sat buried under ice a few miles away. He told the story often in the years that followed, not as a joke about a foolish widower, but as the moment he learned that the quietest people in a town are sometimes the ones who understand it best. He never dug a chamber of his own exactly like Elias had, choosing instead to bank his woodshed against the hillside and vent it properly. But he never again laughed at a neighbor doing something strange to protect the people they loved, because he had seen firsthand what that strangeness was capable of saving, and how close his own family had come to learning that lesson the hard way instead. Years later, long after Cyrus Thistle had passed his own homestead down to his son, and long after Rowan Bellwether had grown gray beside his own hearth, people in Frostback Hollow still told the story of the winter a grieving father dug beneath his own floor, while half the town called it madness. They told it not as a tale about wood or weather, but as a reminder that the people who love us hardest rarely explain themselves before they act. They simply keep digging, keep building, keep protecting, long after everyone else has stopped believing there was anything worth protecting at all. If this story moved you even a little, if it made you think about someone quietly holding your world together without ever asking for thanks, do something small for me before you go. Hit subscribe, because stories like this one deserve to reach the people who still believe in quiet, stubborn love. And there's another one waiting for you, right here, whenever you're ready.